Oh, good evening for a second time, actually. The first time I did this live stream, I had a problem with my audio and I didn't notice it. It looks like I'm doing better now, so that's good. So anyway, um, my name is Justin Tidwell. It's January 26th, and I'm here to review the legislative action that occurred today without rancor or hyperbole. So hopefully you get something out of it. I know I enjoyed doing it. So maybe we can meet somewhere in the middle there. Anyway, I'm going to start today with the White House because the White House actually did some stuff today. First and foremost, maybe not first and foremost, but first, the White House actually did do some proclamations. Again, proclamations really don't have the force of law. They're more attaboys and things like that. In this case, one of them is a commiseration more than an attaboy. But there was a proclamation, the 50th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision. Obviously, President Biden is pro-abortion, and so he likes that decision. I haven't read the actual thing. Yeah, I haven't read it. I'm not going to read it. It's a page and a half of long of small text. Looks like talking about nation's progress toward equality for all in response to the court's extreme Dobbs versus Jackson. I issued executive orders to ensure. So it's basically recounting what he did to preserve as much federal authority over abortion as he could. I'll put it that way. So just so you all know where I come down, I am, and I've said this in my introductory, but I'll just say it again, because this is such a divisive issue. You should probably know where I stand. I am a libertarian, hardcore libertarian, but I'm also a federalist. So the Constitution makes it pretty clear that we've got independent states pseudo-independent states independent states is the wrong word. I'm sorry, I'm framing that incorrectly. We have states that have made a federal government together, and those states have abdicated certain rights to the federal government. But the assumption is that if it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution that the federal government gets to do it, the federal government doesn't get to do it. That's basically what the Constitution says. So when you start talking about things like abortion, that's obviously a state issue. Now, having said that, I wouldn't support legislation that outlaws abortion in my particular state. Not because I disagree with it, not because I think abortion is okay. I personally don't. But I'm a libertarian. It's not my business. Unless it's me who's pregnant, which, I mean, I'm a guy. I can't get pregnant. So it's not my business. Personal feelings aside, it's just not my business. So I personally wouldn't support legislation in the state that I'm in that would limit a woman's ability to have an abortion. But if another state passes such a law, that is equally none of my business because I don't live in that state. That's the whole point of a federal system. So you'll hear probably that opinion coming through. And so I just wanted to explicitly state it so that there was no misunderstanding of why does he have that weird smirk on his face, or why is he speaking in that tone? Yeah, that's why, because I fundamentally disagree with President Biden's position on abortion. He wants to make it a federal issue. I absolutely disagree with Roe v. Wade, not because I think that it's my right to tell, or anybody's right to tell someone who can get pregnant, i.e., women, um, what they can and cannot do, but because it's not a federal issue. And Roe v. Wade made it a federal issue. Dobbs said, no, it's not a federal issue. So I agree with Dobbs. But I don't agree with states passing laws that restrict women's rights to have an abortion. So anyway, 50th anniversary, Roe v. Wade. Basically, again, Biden just recounting what he did in response to Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision. And then the other one is a nice one, honoring the victims of the tragedy in Monterey Park, California. And even though, these proclamations don't have the force of law at all, it's just you can think of this one as the president writing a kind letter. I haven't read it, and I don't care to, because my guess is there's some gun control stuff in there. And I don't, again, libertarian. I'm a big Second Amendment advocate. So when I see politicians using tragedy to try to guilt people into limiting the Second Amendment, it just makes me mad. So I'm not going to read it, because I'm guessing that some of that's in there. But the sentiment of saying, hey, it's an awful thing what happened in Monterey Park, California, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. Okay, so those two proclamations. Now, in addition to those two proclamations, President Biden issued a memorandum, I'll say, which I'll get to in just a minute, and then a foreign assistance delegation of authority, so $2.5 billion delegated to helping out Ukraine. I don't think it's sending them money. I don't think it could be, but it's $2.5 billion. And who's the person? Hold on. I hereby delegate the Secretary of State the authority under Section 506A1 to direct the drawdown of up to $2.5 billion in defense articles and services of the Department of Defense and military education and training to provide assistance. Yeah, so it's defense articles. So we're still not sending anything in this particular delegation of authority. Anyway, only things that are used for defense, and then military education and training for Ukraine. So supporting Ukraine without actually giving them bullets is kind of the intent, is kind of the gist there. Then he actually issued a memorandum. And this one is, again, related to abortion. What he did, this is the title on the memorandum is Further Efforts to Protect Access to Reproductive Health Care Services. And what it does, the first section really describes mifepristone. Mifepristone is a drug that has been approved for years and years and years, that women can use as a chemical abortion. What's that word? I can't remember the word, but a chemical way in which to induce an abortion. And it spends the first few paragraphs just talking about, hey, this is what this is what the FDA has done. This is a safe drug. So on and so forth. Then it gets into, hey, we did this Executive Order 14076 because of the Dobbs, as in response to the Dobbs decision. And then he talks about how bad things are because of the Dobbs decision, just a little bit, not too much politicking, but a little bit. Then he gets into the actual order, and the order is basically twofold. First thing is mifepristone. One of the things they talk about in the upfront section is that mifepristone during all the lockdowns, there 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 came to be a practice of people having teleconferences with doctors and getting prescribed mifepristone over the phone, and then getting their drug and taking their drug and having a chemically induced abortion. Um, and what he's saying in this memorandum is, hey, I want the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, for some reason, I haven't the faintest clue why I didn't include the Secretary of Homeland Security. But anyway, the Attorney General and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, both of those make a lot of sense. Um, and I want them to consider issuing guidance for patients and, I'll say generically, entities, maybe pharmacies that want to either use or distribute mifepristone, how they can do it in states that have passed laws banning abortion, how they can how they can prescribe and get mifepristone to the actual patient in a legal way. And then there's another section that says, hey, again, to the Attorney General, and then again, Secretary of Homeland Security for whatever reason, and then Secretary of Health and Human Services, give the Interagency Task Force on Reproductive Healthcare Access. That's something that was established via Executive Order 14076. A sense as to what states are trying to do to circumvent our efforts here. States that are obviously states that have put in legislation to ban abortion. what they're doing to circumvent what we're trying to do in this memorandum. So that's kind of the heart of this memorandum. And like I said, that this one actually is quite material in terms of public policy. Again, whether you agree with it or not, has a lot to do with your opinion on abortion, has, depending on how interested you are in politics, how big you are on states' rights, all these kinds of things. But that's what the memorandum's for. Okay, so that ends it on the federal side. Now let's go ahead and talk about the Senate, the federal side. That ends it on the presidential side, on the White House. Now let's talk about the Senate. The Senate, first, I'll talk about something that was fairly simple. So it's Senate Resolution 13 designating January 2023 as National Stalking Awareness Month. And this is actually, I mean, again, it's just a Senate resolution. It doesn't have any force of law, but it is nice. Stalking is an awful thing. It really does terrify people, even when it doesn't escalate to violence. It is terrifying to people. So it's nice to see, even though there's no law, even there's no force of law here, and there shouldn't be. Again, the stalking is a state problem, but it's nice to see the Senate acknowledging that it's a real issue and encouraging states and municipalities to do things to deal with it. That's great. That's great. The next thing that the Senate did, and they spent a lot of time doing this, it was odd when you understand what they're doing. They call it the American Vehicle Securities Act. So the Senate and the House passed an omnibus bill, basically for spending last year, and part of that included a tax credit for electric vehicles. And there's a clause in that omnibus bill. It's in section 13401K of the Public Law 117169. The reason that's Public Law 117169 is because it's been passed but it hasn't been integrated into the U.S. code yet. So it's referencing the actual bill that was passed. And what it says is there's this section that says it's basically talking about the per vehicle dollar limitation on related requirements for this tax credit. And so this is the all the law says, all the American Vehicle Securities Act does is repeals this paragraph. The amendment, so I'm quoting the paragraph. The amendments made by subsections A and E shall apply to vehicles placed in service after the date on which the proposed guidance described in paragraph 3B of section 30DE of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 as added by subsection E is issued by the Secretary of Treasury or the Secretary's delegate. I just love reading the law. It's like it's riveting. Anyway, and the reason that, so when I was listening to the debate, I'll say this: when I was listening to the debate, there was a lot of bloviating about how the IRS wasn't doing their job and the IRS was cherry picking what they wanted to enforce, and things like that. And they were saying that this will fix that. I honestly haven't the faintest clue how striking this one paragraph is going to fix that, but I'm also not a legal. So, but anyway, they spent quite a bit of time debating it. They didn't actually put it up for a vote, but they did spend a bit of time debating it. Maybe they'll vote on it tomorrow. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they won't. It was interesting though. Okay, last but not least, the House. The first thing the House did was pass HRES 60, and it was weird. So it was considered a privileged matter, which is fine, whatever. But the weird part was, like, they actually cut out the audio. So I was watching. You can go to live.house.gov and you can just see what's going on. And what they did is they actually cut the audio out for like 30 or 40 seconds while they were doing this one thing, voting on this one HRES 60. And then they brought the audio back in. So I haven't a clue. My guess is it's some totally mundane thing, like, whatever, appointing somebody to some super secret committee or something. But it was kind of funny that they just kind of, cut out the audio for a minute. Anyway, I have no idea what HRES 60 does, but they passed it. And they passed it in about 30 seconds. So there you go. Then they spent the rest of the day, and it was a long day, debating HR 21. Okay, so HR 21 is to provide for the development of a plan to increase oil and gas production under oil and gas leases of federal lands under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Interior, and the Secretary of Defense, in conjunction with a drawdown of petroleum reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Boy, that's long-winded, made me cough. Oof. Okay. So all that jibber jabber is there because the Republicans in the House said that they were butthurt because I don't know how many of you remember this, but the President Biden some time ago drew down oil reserves in the Strategic Oil Reserve, basically to reduce the price of gas at the tank, and it was conveniently enough, kind of, and at the time that it would help in the midterm elections. So the Republicans cried foul. Oh, how dare you use the Strategic Oil Reserve as a political football? Of course, the Republicans were using the high gas prices to beat up Democrats. So I mean, a little bit disingenuous, but again, politicians. What do you expect? And I'm not sure. I haven't. I get the sense that Biden's not the only one that has strategically use the strategic oil reserve to affect domestic prices of gasoline. As I recall, that's been done a few times over the years. I could be wrong. Like I said, I'm not positive about that. But uh, anyway, it's. But this piece of legislation, HR 21, what it does is it is true that it is the president's prerogative to draw down the strategic oil reserve. But the strategic oil reserve was set up for emergencies, true emergencies, um, wartime stuff, right? That was the concept behind it, or at least that's what that's what a lot of people say. The concept behind the strategic oil reserve was. It was stood up during the early 70s when OPEC decided that they were going to limit oil production to the United States. So, in a major supply crisis, things like that. Anyway, um, what this legislation does is it doesn't try to take away the president's right to do that. But what it does is it says, hey, president, if you draw down the strategic oil reserve when it's not a true supply emergency, wartime thing, whatever, when it's not a true emergency, if you decide to draw down the strategic oil reserve before you pull 1 gallon of oil out of the strategic oil reserve, you have to work with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Agriculture to put together a plan to make oil and gas leases on federal lands available sufficient to replace what you draw down. That's what it says. Now, there were a bunch of so what ended up happening is um, the Speaker of the House had said one of the promises that he made was that things were going to be more transparent in Washington D.C., i.e., you're going to be seeing floor debates and stuff like that. So what he did is, as opposed to shuffling off all the amendment process to a subcommittee, he directed the House to basically um, debate all the amendments in open session. And I mean, it wasn't quite open session, but it doesn't matter. Everybody was there, the whole floor was there, and the cameras were on. So he's keeping his promise, right? It's open. I'm showing you how the sausage is made. So there were 24 amendments today. 4 of them passed. Most of the amendments they did fail. Most of the amendments that fail were amendments like, hey, yeah, the secretary, but the secretary can't use leases in my backyard, right? There were a bunch of amendments that said, hey, you can't do Southern California, you can't do Central California, you can't do Northern California, you can't do stuff off the coast in California, you can't do stuff off the coast in Washington or Oregon, you can't do stuff off the coast of Virginia. Basically, a bunch of, well, yeah, they can draw these plans up, but they can't use this area. All those failed. And then there were some that did pass. The ones that passed were ones like protecting against strategic oil reserve oil getting into the hands of our enemies, quote unquote. And some of the amendments actually labeled specifically like China, Iran, stuff like that as enemies. I can't remember if that's one of the ones that passed, but hold on. Yeah, it did pass. One of the amendments was to make sure that none of the drawdown can actually go to Iran, China, North Korea, or Russia, specifically. But those are the types of amendments that actually did pass, and then some housekeeping type amendments. So the actual legislation wasn't voted on today. All they did was the amendment process, and quite frankly, I'm not sure if they're done with the amendment process. But either way, what was a very pithy piece of legislation, just honestly like 4 or 5 sentences long, very, very short. With the 4 amendments that passed, it's going to get a little bit longer, probably not a whole lot longer, but we don't know what the final text is yet because they've got to incorporate these amendments. And then if they do actually have any other amendments and pass them, then they'll include those too. So again, it's a lot of things that the Republicans are doing in the House. This particular bill is a lot of face time with the public, and it feels like it's hey, we really disagree with what the president's doing with the strategic oil reserve, and we're going to let our constituents know that we really disagree with it. Will this bill? I mean, I'm guessing it's going to pass the House. Will it pass the Senate? I don't know. Will the president sign it? I don't know. This is kind of a separation of powers thing, right? And the president, ignoring all the politics, what this is really doing is this is saying, well, yeah, you've got the authority to do what you have the authority to do, but you have to do this other thing too. And presidents historically have been loath to sign things like that because it does limit separation of powers a bit. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, so for a second round, hopefully, you got something good out of this, and we'll chalk up my first one as just a practice run. So hope you all have a good night. And if there's legislative stuff tomorrow, then we'll talk about legislative stuff tomorrow. Thanks. Bye-bye.